On March 31st, 2026, Google's quantum AI team published a single research paper that quietly rewrote the security assumptions behind every dark web transaction ever made. And the number buried inside that paper should terrify anyone who has ever trusted cryptocurrency to keep them anonymous. Breaking the elliptic curve, cryptography protecting Bitcoin, Ethereum, and nearly every blockchain used across dark web marketplaces could require 20 times fewer quantum resources than researchers estimated just 7 years earlier, cutting a threat once considered decades away down to a timeline some experts now measure in years. This is not speculation from a fringe blog or a doomsday YouTube thumbnail exaggerating for clicks. This is Google's own quantum AI division, the same lab pushing the frontier of quantum hardware forward every year, telling the world that the mathematical wall protecting cryptocurrency transactions just got dramatically shorter than anyone expected. For over a decade, dark web marketplaces have run almost entirely on cryptocurrency, and the entire underground economy built around them, drug markets, stolen data exchanges, illicit services, mixing platforms designed to launder transaction histories, all of it rests on a single shared assumption that the blockchain recording every transaction publicly and permanently is still somehow anonymous. That anonymity was never really about hiding the transaction itself. Since every single payment on Bitcoin or Ethereum is visible to anyone in the world who wants to look, it was about the mathematical impossibility of turning a public key visible on that ledger back into the private key, proving who actually controls it. Strip away that one mathematical wall, and every transaction sitting on a public blockchain instantly becomes a permanent, unerasable record connecting a real identity to years of financial activity, exactly the kind of exposure dark web users have spent a decade assuming was structurally impossible. To understand why this matters so much for the dark web specifically, you need to understand what actually protects a cryptocurrency wallet in the first place. Every wallet holding Bitcoin or Ethereum has two keys, a public key that identifies where funds live, and a private key that proves ownership and authorizes spending. The entire system depends on a mathematical one-way function called elliptic curve cryptography, a relationship designed so that deriving the private key from the public key is essentially impossible for any classical computer on Earth, even one running for longer than the universe has existed. That impossibility is the entire foundation dark webs. Marketplaces have quietly relied on for over a decade. The assumption that even if every transaction is publicly visible on the blockchain forever, nobody could ever reverse engineer the actual owner's private key from the public information sitting in plain sight. Quantum computing was built from day one to demolish exactly that kind of one-way function, using an algorithm named Shor's algorithm, and Google's March 2026 research shows that demolition job requiring far less quantum horsepower than anyone had budgeted for. It helps to actually sit with why Shor's algorithm is so uniquely dangerous to this specific kind of encryption, rather than just accepting it as a scary buzzword. Classical computers struggle with elliptic curve problems because finding a private key from a public key requires essentially guessing your way through an astronomically large search space, a task so large that even the fastest classical supercomputers on the planet would need more time than the universe has existed to brute force their way through it. Shor's algorithm exploits a completely different approach available only to quantum computers, using the strange properties of superposition and interference to identify mathematical patterns hidden inside that search space far faster than any classical method ever could. It is not a faster brute force search. It is an entirely different category of attack, one that turns a problem considered permanently unsolvable into a problem solvable in minutes or hours once enough stable, error-corrected qubits are available. That distinction between speeding up an old attack and enabling a fundamentally new kind of attack is exactly why cryptographers have spent decades warning that quantum computing would not just weaken encryption gradually, it would break specific types of encryption instantly and completely the moment sufficient hardware existed. Like and subscribe if this is the first time you're hearing just how exposed cryptocurrency actually is, because the specific numbers coming out of this research are almost impossible to overstate. Google's paper modeled a realistic attack scenario where a quantum computer could hijack a live Bitcoin transaction with a 41% success rate during the standard 10-minute confirmation window that every Bitcoin transfer goes through before it's permanently recorded. A separate research collaboration between Caltech and a quantum startup called Oratomic pushed the numbers even further, suggesting a neutral atom quantum computer with roughly 26,000 qubits could crack the ECC 256 encryption, securing major blockchains in about 10 days, while a full RSA 2048 break would take around 100,000 qubits in roughly 3 months. One particularly alarming projection out of the same research wave suggested that, under a specific set of assumptions, a quantum computer could derive a private key from an exposed public key in as little as 9 minutes, fast enough to front run and drain a wallet before its original transaction even finishes confirming on the network. Here is where this story becomes specifically terrifying for anyone connected to dark web activity, rather than just casual crypto holders. Researchers studying this threat have identified that roughly 6.9 million Bitcoin, close to a third of the entire circulating supply, currently sits in wallets where the public key has already been exposed on the blockchain, either because the address is an old-style legacy wallet or because it has been reused after a previous transaction. That exposed pool includes coins tied to Satoshi Nakamoto's original holdings, but it also includes an enormous volume of funds that moved through dark web marketplaces over the years, because dark web transactions historically favored exactly the kind of address reuse in older wallet formats that leave a public key sitting fully visible for anyone patient enough to wait for the technology to catch up. Every payment ever made for anything on a dark web marketplace, every mixing service transaction, every wallet that touched an exchange with weak privacy practices, all of it lives permanently on a public ledger. And a meaningful share of it already meets the exact exposure criteria this new quantum research targets. The mechanics of exactly when a public key becomes exposed matter enormously here. And most people using cryptocurrency, on the dark web or otherwise, have never actually thought about it. A Bitcoin address itself is not the same thing as a public key. It is a hashed, shortened representation of one, which means funds sitting untouched in a fresh address technically keep their underlying public key hidden until the moment those funds are actually spent. The instant you send a transaction, though, your full public key gets attached to that transaction and permanently broadcast to the entire network, visible forever afterward to anyone looking at the blockchain. This means the danger is not evenly distributed across every wallet in existence. It is concentrated specifically in addresses that have transacted at least once, and dark web activity, by its very nature, involves exactly that kind of repeated spending, receiving payment for goods or services, moving funds through additional wallets, cashing out through exchanges, each step potentially exposing another public key permanently to a future quantum adversary patient enough to wait. Multiply that pattern across an entire decade of dark web commerce, thousands of vendors, millions of buyers, countless mixing services attempting to obscure the trail, and you start to see the true scale of what sits exposed on public blockchains right now, waiting for hardware that grows more plausible with every research cycle. This brings us to the harvest now, decrypt later threat, and it is the single most important concept to understand if you actually want to grasp the real timeline here instead of just the scary headlines. An adversary does not need a working quantum computer today to start winning this fight. They only need to record exposed public keys today and wait patiently for the hardware to mature enough to crack them open later. Every dark web transaction sitting in a wallet with an exposed public key is already effectively frozen in time, waiting, and the identity of whoever controls that wallet is only as safe as the gap between today and whenever a sufficiently powerful quantum computer finally comes online. Bitcoin security researcher Justin Drake, someone deeply embedded in the technical side of this ecosystem, put the odds at least 10% that a quantum computer recovers a private key from an exposed public key by the year 2032, a number that sounds modest, until you remember what a 10% chance of catastrophic exposure means for anyone whose safety depends on that exposure never happening. Governments have responded to this shift with a seriousness that tells you everything about how real the underlying threat actually is. 2026 has been formally designated the year of quantum security. By multiple national bodies tracking this issue, Google has set itself an internal 2029 deadline to fully migrate its own infrastructure to post-quantum cryptography, and NIST's official roadmap calls for deprecating current encryption standards entirely by 2030. None of these deadlines mean cryptocurrency wallets are unlocked tomorrow morning, but they represent a dramatic compression of a timeline that used to feel comfortably distant, decades of breathing room collapsing into a much tighter and more urgent window, measured in single-digit years rather than generations. It is worth pausing on why a government agency setting an internal migration deadline is such a meaningful signal rather than just bureaucratic housekeeping. Organizations like NIST do not publish formal deprecation roadmaps for encryption standards on a whim. These decisions come after years of consultation with cryptographers, hardware researchers, and intelligence agencies who have far more visibility into classified quantum computing progress than anything published in an open access paper. When a body like NIST tells the world that current encryption standards should be considered deprecated by 2030, that is effectively the closest thing to an official government confirmation that the threat timeline has meaningfully shortened, delivered through the cautious, understated language institutions use specifically to avoid triggering panic while still pushing critical infrastructure toward urgent action. The same logic applies to Google setting its own internal 2029 deadline, a company with more visibility into the actual pace of quantum hardware progress than almost anyone outside a handful of specialized labs, choosing to move its own infrastructure years ahead of the broader industry consensus, is not a decision made out of excessive caution. It is a decision made by people who understand exactly how fast this technology is actually advancing behind closed doors. Not everyone in the cryptography and cryptocurrency world agrees on how urgent this actually is, and it is worth hearing the skeptical side honestly, rather than only chasing the scariest possible framing. Respected voices like Blockstream's Adam Back continue to argue the real threat sits 20 to 40 years out, pointing to the enormous engineering gap between today's experimental quantum processors and a fault-tolerant machine stable enough to run these attacks reliably against real-world targets rather than laboratory test conditions. Building a quantum computer capable of executing Shor's algorithm against live encryption at scale requires solving error correction problems that remain genuinely unsolved, and skeptics are right that headlines chasing quantum fear for engagement tend to compress these timelines more aggressively than the actual engineering. Reality supports. The honest summary sitting between these two camps is that expert timelines now range anywhere from the early 2030s to the middle of the century. And critically, every fresh piece of research published over the last year has moved that range earlier rather than later, never the other direction. That last detail is worth dwelling on because it is the single strongest piece of evidence that this is not just another overhyped tech scare cycle. Skepticism about quantum threats used to be grounded in a stable, decades-old consensus about how many qubits a real attack would require, and that consensus held reasonably steady for years, giving the cryptocurrency world plenty of comfortable room to plan a gradual migration on its own timeline. What changed in 2026 is not that the skeptics suddenly became wrong about quantum computers being hard to build. They remain correct about that. What changed is that the target itself moved dramatically closer, not because building quantum hardware got easier, but because researchers found smarter, more efficient mathematical shortcuts for attacking elliptic curve. Cryptography specifically, shortcuts that require far less raw hardware than anyone assumed possible. Even a committed skeptic has to reckon with the fact that the resource requirement for this particular attack has been revised downward by a factor of 20 in less than a decade, and there is no guarantee the next research paper won't cut that number again. What makes the dark web specifically more exposed than the broader cryptocurrency ecosystem comes down to a detail most casual observers miss entirely: the actual size of the cryptographic keys involved. Blockchain systems use elliptic curve keys that are almost an order of magnitude smaller than the RSA keys used to protect comparable security levels elsewhere on the internet, which means a quantum computer needs meaningfully less raw computing power to crack blockchain encryption than it would need to break the encryption protecting, say, a government communication system or a banking network running older RSA standards. That smaller key size was originally a feature, making blockchain transactions faster and cheaper to process, but it has quietly become one of the biggest liabilities in the entire quantum threat conversation because it means cryptocurrency, the exact payment rail dark web marketplaces depend on almost universally, sits closer to the front of the line for a working quantum attack than most other encrypted systems people rely on every day. This puts dark web cryptocurrency users in a uniquely uncomfortable position compared to almost anyone else worried about quantum computing. A bank protected by RSA 2048 encryption is looking at roughly 100,000 qubits in months of runtime under current research estimates before a quantum attack becomes viable against its systems. A Bitcoin wallet with an exposed public key, protected by the smaller elliptic curve keys the entire cryptocurrency ecosystem is built on, sits at a fraction of that requirement. Some estimates suggesting as few as 26,000 qubits and roughly 10 days of runtime under favorable conditions. That gap matters enormously when you consider which target a well-resourced adversary, whether a criminal organization, an intelligence agency, or anyone else with early access to meaningful quantum hardware, would choose to go after first. Every rational actor pursuing this technology is going to spend their earliest, most limited quantum resources against the softest, most valuable targets available, and blockchain wallets sitting on years of dark web transaction history represent both. The defense against this threat has technically already started, though how far along it actually is depends heavily on which blockchain you're talking about. Bitcoin developers have formally proposed something called BIP360, a quantum-resistant address format, which was merged into Bitcoin's official proposal repository on February 11th, 2026, representing the first serious coordinated technical response to this threat at the protocol level. But Bitcoin's famously decentralized, consensus-driven culture makes agreeing on urgent security upgrades slow and contentious by design, and unlike Ethereum, which has published a coordinated and well-funded post-quantum migration roadmap with clearer timelines, Bitcoin still lacks a single unified plan that the entire network has agreed to execute. Upgrading an entire blockchain to post-quantum security standards is not something that happens with a single software update. Pushed overnight, it requires years of coordinated adoption across miners, wallet providers, exchanges, and every individual holder choosing to migrate their funds into new address formats, and estimates for a full fix currently range somewhere between 5 and 7 years, even under optimistic assumptions. For anyone genuinely worried about what this means for funds sitting in older or reused addresses, security researchers tracking this issue have converged on a handful of practical recommendations worth understanding, even if the underlying threat itself is still years away from becoming an active, real-world attack. The single most important habit is avoiding address reuse entirely, since every time a public key gets exposed by spending from an address, that exposure becomes permanent and irreversible on the blockchain forever. Moving funds to a fresh, never-used address does not make a wallet quantum-proof, but it does reset the exposure clock, keeping the public key hidden until the moment it is spent again. Watching for post-quantum compatibility. Announcements from wallet providers, exchanges, and custody services has also become a meaningful signal of which parts of the ecosystem are taking this threat seriously, versus which parts are still treating it as a distant, low-priority concern. None of this amounts to panic advice, and researchers studying the issue have specifically warned against unsubstantiated fear being weaponized as its own kind of attack on confidence in these systems, but deliberate, informed preparation now looks very different from the comfortable assumption of total safety that defined the first 15 years of cryptocurrency's existence. That gap between how fast the offensive research is accelerating and how slowly the defensive migration can realistically move is exactly the gap that should worry anyone whose funds, transactions, or identity are tied up in dark web activity that touched cryptocurrency at any point over the last decade. A working, large-scale quantum attack against live blockchain encryption has not been demonstrated in the real world yet, and meaningful engineering hurdles still separate today's experimental quantum hardware from a machine capable of running these attacks reliably outside a laboratory. But the entire point of Harvest Now, Decrypt Later, is that waiting for a public demonstration before taking this seriously misses the actual danger, because by the time a working attack is publicly confirmed, every exposed public key sitting on the blockchain today will have already been sitting there, harvestable, for years. If you strip away the technical jargon, this story comes down to one uncomfortable truth, that the cryptocurrency and dark web ecosystems built their entire foundation on an assumption nobody thought would ever be tested. This soon, the assumption that a public key sitting openly on a blockchain forever was permanently safe simply because no computer could ever reverse it. That assumption held for over 15 years, and it is now being actively dismantled research paper by research paper, each new publication shaving years off the comfortable timeline everyone had gotten used to. The technology to actually execute this attack at scale does not exist yet, but the mathematics proving it is coming has already been published, peer-reviewed, and confirmed by multiple independent research teams working from completely different directions. And every single one of them arrived at the same unsettling conclusion that the wall-protecting dark web transactions is a lot thinner than anyone building on top of it ever wanted to admit. What used to be a comfortable multi-decade cushion of safety has compressed in the span of a single research cycle into a countdown that serious cryptographers, government agencies, and blockchain developers alike are now treating as an active, present-tense problem rather than a distant hypothetical worth revisiting sometime later. Like and subscribe if you want to stay ahead of stories like this before mainstream coverage catches up, because the gap between what quantum computers can already prove mathematically and what most people assume is still safely decades away is closing faster than almost anyone outside specialist research circles realizes. Drop a comment telling me whether you think blockchain networks will actually finish migrating to quantum-resistant standards before a working attack arrives, or whether the Harvest Now, Decrypt Later threat has already quietly compromised more dark web transaction history than anyone currently understands. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay with this channel because this quantum encryption race against cryptocurrency security is only just getting started. The countdown clock ticking underneath every exposed wallet on the blockchain is not going to stop for anyone who isn't paying attention.